everybody. Welcome to Digital Hammurabi. I am your host, Megan Lewis, along with my husband, Dr. Joshua Bowen. He is in the side chat. He'll be collecting any questions that you have for today's guest. And today's guest is Dr. Seth Sanders, who is a professor of religious studies at the University of California, Davis. Dr. Sanders earned his PhD from the Johns Hopkins University in Near Eastern Studies with a focus on the Hebrew Bible and Northwest Semitic philology. He's worked at a host of academic institutions, including Hebrew University and the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University, and has received several honors and awards, including fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Guggenheim. Dr. Sanders is also a founding member of the Brain Collective, an inclusive open access research group for the study of the biblical and ancient Near Eastern literatures and the cultural worlds in the 21st century. And we'll be talking more about the Brain Collective a little bit later on. His most recent book, From Adapa to Enoch, Scribal Culture and Religious Vision in Judea and Babylonia, deals with the traditions of Enoch and Adapa and their place in scribal culture and tradition. And this is the topic which Dr. Sanders has very kindly agreed to talk to us today. So Dr. Sanders, hello, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was a little bit of a rushed introduction. Is there anything you want to add about your work and why you do it?
Oh, gosh. I think I just want to say that the reason that I've been able to work in a fairly broad range of things and deal with what strikes me as some especially hard problems in the history of the Near East, the Bible, and the cultural context is because I worked with other people a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So even right when I got my PhD, I worked with Wayne Horowitz and Takayoshi Oshima, who are two of the world's greatest Assyriologists, on a book called Cuneiform in Canaan, which collected all of the cuneiform texts found in Israel and Palestine. And I edited the alphabetic cuneiform, the Ugaritic type ones in there. And then immediately after that, I worked at the Oriental Institute. I hosted a collaboration between linguistic anthropologists and all kinds of Near Eastern philologists, as well as the Indologist Sheldon Pollock. And that kind of gave me this big picture sense of how literatures change, but also, just as importantly, that continuing history kind of enabled me to look at both Babylonian and Hebrew and other Northwest Semitic cultures on their own terms and in more depth than I would have if I were just working on my own, because I had people like next to me or people I was talking to who could actually tell me like what this stuff was really like, and not just there's a thing in our field where you just see something in translation, or you hear something kind of superficial, and then you forget about, let's say, Babylon, and then you forget that this is a culture with like almost 3,000 year written record. And you can get into a lot of trouble generalizing about it, in the same way as if you talked about all of European culture, all of European history. It's a deep, deep place.
And that was actually something that came across quite strongly for me when I was reading your faculty page to put together that introduction, is how much work there is with other people, and how kind of very open you are to interdisciplinary and collaborative work, which I think is fantastic and is something that really helps push the field and push scholarship forward, apart from just sitting on your own essentially and working through cuneiform or Hebrew texts and trying to get your own conclusions. So no, that was fantastic. So this is the book that we are going to be talking about today, which there we go, is very enjoyable. And Josh and I I've made it most of the way through. Josh read it in its entirety, and it was absolutely fascinating. So would you be able to give a brief summary for people who have not been able to read it, and tell us what your goals were in writing it?
Yeah, so it deals with two old, but I think still really kind of burning questions for the field of Bible and Near Eastern studies. The first one is very, very basic, which is what do these people who wrote this literature think they were doing? What did they? Because one thing that we know about the Bible is that it contains a lot of things that are supposed to be the word of God, that are said to be, the word of the Lord came to me and said X. You get this, all throughout. But sometimes the messages seem to change, or diverge, or even contradict. Famously, there's two contradictory versions of how the world is created at the very beginning of the Bible. So it starts off with, but so then the question becomes, why did these people, how did they think that they could just write these other things? They could change what they said was the word of God, or add in versions of the word of God that contradicted the first version. This has to be deliberate. It wasn't just an accident of, that they put a bunch of, scrolls into a hat and then pulled out the two that they just grabbed first. So who did they think they were? And the second one that turns out to be related is about how to understand the contacts and relationships between ancient Israel and Judah, the cultures that created the Hebrew Bible, and their neighbors, because ever since we discovered ancient Babylonian literature, and then one of the first long readable texts that was ever translated was the flood story in the Gilgamesh, and people flipped out when they realized that there was a version of Noah's flood that was older than Noah's flood, but had a lot of the same details. The plot's almost identical. A lot of the wording is similar in two different languages. And so initially people were like, did the Hebrews just steal this from the Babylonians? And then people have fought over what all these similarities mean, and how do you understand the contact between the two cultures? Did they just steal things? Was it, or is it a more superficial, meaningless kind of, people just like to tell those kinds of stories? So the connection between those two, what did the creators of the Bible think they were doing? And what is the relationship between the culture that produced the Bible and their neighbors, and in particular Mesopotamia, came together in the book in this way? There are two people who are kind of the role models for scribes and scholars, the role models for the people who wrote a lot of the religious literature that turned into the Bible, or that turned into Mesopotamian religious literature. And in Mesopotamia, there's the very famous one named Adapa, who is, as the great Sumerologist Pyotr Mikolovsky said, he's the most talked about mythological figure from a literary text. I mean, other than the gods, people mention gods all the time, but as a character, he's incredibly popular. And scribes also at some points claimed to be him. They claimed to be this semi-human, superpowered sage who went to heaven, met the gods, and is also said to have uttered a number of the most important works of religious literature. And at the same time, there are a few different people in ancient Judea, in the in the Hebrew and Aramaic writers who created what we have of the Bible and early Jewish literature. There's a few times when these scribes also identify with a heavenly revealer figure. There in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you get a lot of this. People say, I was enthroned in heaven. People will say, and these are clearly the worshippers or scholars in the it's being used by the Dead Sea Scrolls community. They say, I'll be an enlightened scribe like David. But one of the most popular stories was about this character Enoch. In the Bible, Enoch is just very mysterious. He's the missing patriarch. In Genesis, it says of every one of the patriarchs, and anyone who's tried just opened a Bible and tried to read through Genesis will get these. Methuselah lived this long and he begat this many children, and then he died, and then his child lived this long, begat this many children, and then he died, and this person lived this long and begat this many children. And suddenly, with Enoch, it says, God took him, and and nobody else in the whole Bible is said to have simply been taken up by God. There's a nice heavenly chariot scene with Elijah, but that's about it. So then the question was, both of these, the creators of a lot of Mesopotamian religious literature and the creators of a lot of Hebrew religious literature identified with this kind of super sage. And so I was just curious, did they get the idea from Mesopotamia? Did they steal it, or were they otherwise influenced? How did the influence happen? How did the connection happen? And then B, what did it mean? Like, to say I'm like, to imply that you're like Enoch, or to say I am Adapa, like, what's going on in your head when you say that? So that's the question of the book.
Thank you. So looking at Adapa and Enoch, why do you think they played such a significant role in the history of Mesopotamia and the Hebrew Bible, and appear so often in the literature?
So with Adapa, it's a wonderful thing. He goes way back, and the general name for these kinds of super sages is Apkallu or Abgal in Sumerian, and they're already important at a pretty early period. One of the great early Sumerian temples is founded by hammering images of super sages into the ground to found the temple. This is in Gudea's inscription. And there's this idea around that there are these people who can go between heaven and earth, or bring knowledge from heaven to earth. And it's a way of talking about how you connect to the larger order of the universe. There's also, I have a suspicion that these folks are maybe originally a little bit more, not just priestly, but also shamanic figures, that they may have had some kind of ritual role in having, visions of the gods or journeys to heaven. That is not directly evident in the text. There's myths about journeys to heaven, but we don't get Mesopotamian scribes saying, I went to heaven, as we do in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But you do get this kind of almost mystical idea of where your knowledge comes from. And I think you could look at it two ways. One is it's really propagandistic, that these guys are the bureaucrats who keep the kingdom running. They translate the diplomatic texts and messages for the people you're trying to conquer. They help you plan out your military marches because they know the geography. They do all your logistics, so they keep the engine of empire running with all their writing and knowledge. And so it's helpful to say that their knowledge comes from heaven, and they're not just a bunch of,
they're not just making it up as they go along.
Yeah, or just some jerks who learned it from some other jerks who learned it from some other jerk. Just regular human stuff. Nothing special about it. But the other angle that I think explains, and I think that's true, the power, the relationship of power, the relationships of inequality are real there. But I also think that they believed that this knowledge came from elsewhere, and that they were empowered as they personified the sages, as they could somehow become the great sages of ancient times, that they were empowered to produce divine language, to create it. So that's for Adapa.
So it's less of a purely propagandistic and more of they genuinely believed that the knowledge they were producing and passing along came from the gods through Adapa, through them.
And I would say both. I'd say you know, and this is a thing that you see in this study of, you know, just like why we believe things. And this is something you see, you know, the anthropologists talk about this. It's in a different way. It's in Marx as well. The idea that ideology is how you live. In other words, that it's not just a layer of bogus fantasy wallpapered over a structure of brutal inequality or power, and it's not pure window dressing.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a lived reality for people, but that doesn't mean that it also doesn't have political functions.
Mm-hmm.
Incidentally, there's a Hellenistic, I think, like Hellenistic or late antique writer who specifically says that that's what Mesopotamian priests are.
Mm-hmm.
It describe it as a money-making scam where they dress up in a fish costume to swindle people out of their money. Mm-hmm. And you know, make the king believe them. Yeah. So the people made these kinds of criticisms in antiquity too.
Thank you. So you said that both looking through my questions, in Mesopotamian literature, at least, there are two different ascent to heaven stories looking at Etana and Adapa. So how were those stories, and we've talked about how Adapa was used, but how was Etana used by the people who retold his stories, and what made the two of them different?
Okay, yeah, so it's a fascinating history and super well documented. Again, the thing that's great about this stuff is we can see how these stories lived and changed and what they meant to people in a three-dimensional way that we really can't for the Bible. Quick note first, though, because I realized I got so excited about Adapa, I didn't mention Enoch.
Oh, yeah.
I'll just say really quickly that the reason we know Enoch was so important to people in the Hellenistic period in early Judaism, even though he's not mentioned much in the Bible, he just gets like 2 parts of Genesis, brief mention, is that as soon as we know what books people were really reading in early Judaism, the first archive we find, it's the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's lots of copies of the books of Enoch, even though they didn't make it into the Bible. They were certainly reading and using Enochic literature as much as they were using some biblical books, more than other biblical books, and they were reading it more than they were reading other biblical books. And there are also all kinds of rituals and even calendars that synchronize the lives of the Dead Sea Scrolls community with basically the revelations of Enoch, or the type of thinking that Enoch that's distinctive to Enochic literature. So that's about the importance of Enoch. But to get back to our earliest ascents to heaven, there's a few other little myths and mentions of ascent to heaven, and I tried to cover every single one in my book. So chapter 1 was I think I would like to think that it's the best and most thorough documentation of ascent to heaven in Mesopotamia that you could get in the early 21st century. I'm sure right now somebody has discovered 5 new texts that totally change our picture of that, and I'll be excited to see them. But anyway, the cool thing about Etana is an early, probably mythological Sumerian king. He's mentioned in the Sumerian king list, which is this very early kind of genealogy or origin story of kingship in Mesopotamia. And he also gets his own myth already in the Old Babylonian period. And he's in the myth, he's described as the inventor of kingship or the founder of kingship. And there's some suggestion that in the Sumerian king list, even though there's some kings mentioned before him, and a great French Assyriologist, Jean-Jacques Glasner, argued that he's the main tradition really is that he's the first king, because all of the kings named before him in the Sumerian king list are these kinds of weird, they're either kind of almost sound like pseudo-Sumerian, or else they're names that indicate chaos, like 🀭Bel, everyone was master. It's the name of an early king, supposedly king, but it's clearly a way of saying, yeah, it was just anarchy. Etana, so the idea is Etana ascended to heaven in order to gain progeny and to start a dynasty, because he's king, but he's the first king. He unites all the lands, but he's described as infertile, and so his wife has with a vision of a plant of that grants a lineage and an heir, and so Etana decides he's going to try and find it. And there's a wonderful, weird folkloric tale about an eagle and a snake, and the eagle betrays the snake, and as his punishment, it's pretty wild. It's a little bit like the scorpion and the frog story about. So everyone knows that about the scorpions crossing the river with a frog. It's this crazy folk tale, but it's like, be careful who you pair up with, because they might get you. And in this case, it's not, the snake is actually ironically innocent. He doesn't act like a snake. It's the eagle who screws him over. And so the eagle's punishment is he has to help adopt it, and he has to help Etana. They fly to heaven together, and as with all good Mesopotamian myths, it's broken in the most important part. It's not true with Gilgamesh, but a lot of the others.
Most of the others, though.
Yeah, and but it seems as if he does get his lineage, but also a vision of his own death. Because the crazy thing with Etana is that this is the only Mesopotamian written myth that we know, that we have documented before writing. Piotr Steinkeller, a great Assyriologist from Harvard, has a wonderful article where he shows that there are all of these seals from the period just before myths get written down. And there are lots of seals showing a guy going to heaven on an eagle's back. And Etana gets called a shepherd, which is probably a metaphor like King David is a shepherd that is the guardian of his sheep, namely his people. This is all in the Gospels too. Jesus talks about the good shepherd, but so it's a long-standing metaphor for kingship. But in these seals, Etana literally is a shepherd, and there are these cute scenes of these two dudes who are rolling balls of cheese on a rooftop, and a dog looking up, and they're like, "Hey, where are you going?" And he's going to heaven. So, so Etana is this kind of wonderful myth. But then it falls out of popularity. By the first millennium, he's mainly talked about as an underworld ruler. So from having gone above into heaven, he ends up as a kind of a king or a judge in the realm of the dead. By contrast, the myth of Adapa, it's also documented at an early period. So we find them both written down. The first evidence of both of them is Old Babylonian period, but the myth of Adapa just gains steam. And by the first millennium, the crazy thing is that most of the great Neo-Assyrian kings that we know, not only from their great literature, but from all the people they beat up and killed. So Sargon II, the famous destroyer of the northern kingdom of Israel, it's said that he is the equal of the sage Adapa. And this continues with Esarhaddon and Assurbanipal. These great Neo-Assyrian kings are repeatedly compared to Adapa. So he had this kind of political prestige too. So that's the basic kind of role of Adapa in Mesopotamian civilization. I should tell you the myth really briefly. And that is that Adapa is this super pious servant of the god Enki, who's kind of the lord of magic and secret knowledge. And Adapa is such a good worshiper, and he's such a good student of Enki, that it says his word was like the word of Enki, or that's Sumerian Enki is Babylonian Ea. You'll see him mentioned as both. And so it says one day he was out being a good priest and a good temple servant and catching fish to offer to his god at the temple in Eridu, which is kind of the legendary home of Enki and Adapa. And the south wind, which is the most powerful wind in Mesopotamian myth, comes up and blows his boat over. And there's some dispute over what happens to him, but he's clearly waterlogged and perhaps goes under, but perhaps the wind even drowns him. But he comes up and he utters a magic spell and instantly breaks the wings of the wind. And this is not something a human being is supposed to be able to do. But this, the wind is also the most important for kind of the farming and productivity and ecology in Mesopotamia. So the world is kind of ground to a halt, and the head god, Anu, says, what's happened here? Who messed up the order of the universe? And he says, it's Adapa. Okay, bring him up here. And so he's called out on the carpet in heaven, and his patron god, Enki, first warns him, okay, they're going to try and trick you in heaven, and they're going to give you poisonous food and water, so don't do it. And you can do the other stuff. You can put on the oil they give you, put on the garment, but don't eat. And then they take Adapa to heaven, and they say, why did you do this? And Adapa says, well, the wind attacked me. And the guy just laughs, and he says, you're funny, you humans, with your magic that gives you divine power. You're crazy. You crack me up. Here, have some heavenly food. And here, first put on this heavenly oil and heavenly garment. And Adapa, carefully remembering what his great, PhD advisor or whatever, his wise teacher has told him, puts on the oil, puts on the garment, and doesn't eat or drink. And then Anu says, you poor thing. I think you outsmarted yourself, because that was the food and drink of immortality. And then there's two different versions. There's it's probably about 3 or 4 copies of the text we have, and they may end differently. In one of them, he may have been allowed to stay in heaven. And this is suggested also by a first millennium text that says that the son of Adapa is enthroned in the throne of Anu, the god of heaven. But in most of the versions, he's sent back down to earth. And this is the origin story of his supernatural power, his ability to do both divine things and human things, or bring divine things to the human world. Because the story in both the earliest version, one of the later versions, ends with an incantation to heal the sick. And the incantation seems to be an example of what Adapa brought down from heaven to give to humans.
Fantastic. So, oh, sorry, I'm echoing somewhere. You say that Adapa and his importance continue throughout most of Mesopotamian history. What happens to him when you have the end of native kingship in Babylonia?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting thing. There's all kinds of ways that Mesopotamian culture seems to change. There's a wonderful essay by the comparative religion scholar Jonathan Z. Smith of blessed memory called Wisdom and Apocalyptic, where he first talks about this. But basically, you have all of this great scribal wisdom and magic and ritual that's in some way or other all designed to serve the king and the empire, the different empires, the Babylonian Empire, Assyrian Empire. And what's amazing is that all of the wisdom continues after their employer is gone. After first the Persian invasion and conquest of the Neo-Babylonian Empire around 539 BC, and then the Hellenistic Greek-speaking conquest around 333 BCE. The temples mostly stay, and then some of them even get bigger. So you now have this whole brilliant culture, this ritual and religious culture that's existing, that used to have the king at the center. And one of the cool things is that in some ways the scribes almost take on the role of the king, or they have a parallel, they start to develop a kind of a parallel prestige. So there's a king list from the Hellenistic period, Uruk, that lists the 7 great early kings and tells you that each one had their own accompanying sage, which is a very unusual thing. I think there's like one example of that earlier. And you also start having the sages literally play the role of kings. There's the biggest temple in Uruk, and I think it may be the biggest ziggurat ever built, is the Resh temple of the sky god Anu. And there's a brick, there's a building, there's a building inscription on it. It says that it was saying that it was built by Adapa, which is was absolutely part of the royal or executive function. It's what it's one of the main things that marked a king, was building temples. And now now instead of the king who merely claims to be taking orders from the head god, or who says, I deserve to be king because I was somehow enthroned or inspired by the head god, Adapa, of course, met the head god. Adapa was called up to heaven by Anu, and then he built the great temple of Anu. So there's almost like a more direct connection with the gods now that also becomes possible when you have these sages start to take on some of the prominence of the kings.
So you don't kind of have to go through the king as the intermediary between the human and the divine realm. They're more accessible.
Yeah. And I mean, again, it's still all controlled by these nerds, people who are the masters of writing. But I think they're also in other ways, masters of healing. One of the most important, I mean, Adapa is one of the main kinds of ancient wisdom that he was the patron saint of, is exorcism. And exorcism in Mesopotamia encompasses, it's somewhere between like a confession with a priest in today's, let's say, Catholicism, therapy with an analyst or therapist, and medicine. It encompasses some of all of those things. So you do rituals. I think these exorcism rituals would help affect people's, let's say, at least emotional states, which can be very important, powerful, actually, have a powerful effect on people. And Adapa, already in the Old Babylonian period, the most famous and long-running exorcistic ritual, the exorcist says, I am Adapa, sage of the abyss. And that continues. This ritual is also the latest ritual that we know to have been copied early in the first millennium CE. There are still seem to be manuscripts of it. So yeah, he has this long-running role, not just as a master of secret knowledge that's only available to the expert scholars and scribes, but he's also kind of a provider of healing that that you'd expect would reach out to more ordinary people.
That's fascinating that they have Adapa being invoked and kind of personified by scribes and by healers. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and you even see there's these wonderful plaques of the child stealing demoness Lamashtu, who's kind of the ancestor of Lilith, who, I mean, in some ways, due to the misogyny in a number of these patriarchal traditions we study, Lilith was Adam's first wife in some kinds of midrash, but she gets turned into a child stealing demoness too, because if you argue with your husband, you're going to be a demoness. But with Lamashtu, there's no ambiguity. She's from hell creature. She's not human. There's nothing human about her. She's shown suckling a dog at one breast and a pig at the other. And Adapa is one of the only creatures who can turn her away. And so there are these Lamashtu plaques showing these dudes in fish costumes standing around the bed of quite possibly a pregnant woman or otherwise a patient who needs help in something. And these are they're dressed as semi-human sages of the abyss, and they're there to protect the victim from this demon that a lot of people were worried about.
This is a little off script, but that reminds me of and I'm blanking on the name of the myth. I'm going to bring Josh in. Sorry, Josh. What's the myth that we have on the plague plaque?
Oh, Era.
Oh,
yes.
Era.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Josh.
You didn't need me.
I have a superficial knowledge of vast range of things. you asked me to say anything more profound than that, we'd have to go back to
Oh no, I was just noting that it's interesting that you have this literary figure who kind of carries on throughout Mesopotamian history and has this efficacy that we as like modern people may not expect from a literary mythological figure. And then you've got 𒀭keeping Lamashtu away, but then you also have snippets of 𒀭and Enoch, which is, for those who haven't read it, a mythological text used to ward off plague as like a plague amulet. I love the practical nature of literature and mythology as it gets kind of used.
These were texts that people could wear, or probably with a whole tablet hang on your house. But yeah, they were icons. They weren't just texts in our sense of a bunch of content. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So moving forward in time a little bit, looking at the connections between the Mesopotamian tradition and the Hebrew Bible kind of Aramaic tradition, how did later Judean scribes come into contact with and then use Mesopotamian traditions?
Yeah, so this is the thing that I was very frustrated with, was because I spent a lot of time studying the formal parallels. Oh, they're both heavenly revealers. Oh, they both, were in primordial time, and oh, they both get kind of personified by scribes. But they also don't have a lot of like incredibly precise verbal overlap where it looks like one's a translation of the other. Mm-hmm. So like, how do you so there's a conceptual relationship, there's a shared pattern. And I initially honestly kind of gave up. And in my dissertation, from way back in 1999, I just talked about the structural parallels. And I said, well, Mesopotamian and Judean society went through some of the same changes with the loss of native kingship, the conquest by the Persians, and the by Alexander's Hellenistic Empire. So maybe they also, maybe their scribal cultures went through some of the same changes too. So maybe it's kind of a structural parallel. And then basically, like, another decade of scholarship happened. And there were wonderful books by Alan Lindsay on this secrecy, the parallel sorts of secrecy in Mesopotamia and Hebrew literature, and then especially work by Jonathan Ben Dov, colleague of mine is at Haifa. Well, he's moving to Tel Aviv, I guess. But Jonathan showed how intimately related the astronomical knowledge in some of the Enoch literature is with the astronomical knowledge that's connected with Adapa in Mesopotamian literature. That one of these is clearly based on the other. And people were starting to, at the same time, study little details of people's careers, what you'd call prosopography, who was running the Babylonian temples, for example. And when you put that stuff together, you suddenly understand, the whole thing suddenly gets a lot simpler. Because for 100 years, people were saying, "Well, we don't know. I mean, they don't have any tablets in first millennium Jerusalem. We don't know what we don't know if King David's or Hezekiah's scribes were reading tablets. So we really don't know. Who knows? Could be anything. Maybe there's a coincidence. Maybe it's shared culture, or maybe it's a direct translation." And you get all these theories at once. This, by the way, is still happening with study of Deuteronomy and the treaty curses in Neo-Assyrian treaty curses. That they sound very similar. The Deuteronomy 28's curses and these Neo-Assyrian curses, and a lot of them happen in the same order. But to this day, people are still like, I don't know, man. I mean, we don't have any direct. We don't have anything where there's a translation sitting on the table of a scribe. But yeah, the whole thing gets a lot simpler once you realize that by the Persian period, the same people were running both institutions. The people who were in control of the temples and education by the late Persian period in Babylon were Aramaic writing parchment scribes. It's an interesting thing. They rose to a position of power because some native Babylonian families revolted against the Achaemenids, the Persian rulers. So the Persian ruler says, all right, you guys are out of here. We're getting rid of some of the old school scribal families who used Babylonian and tablets, and we're going to introduce some new people who know Babylonian but also write in Aramaic and parchment. These are the new folks who use the new writing techniques, new language. And so a lot of these guys are running Babylonian temples by the end of the Persian period. So by then, at the heart of Babylonian scholarship are people who are trained in Aramaic, kind of a standardized Aramaic. At the same time, these are the same guys who are teaching Hebrew scribes how to write. And this is the kind of thing that if you don't do like some epigraphy, this is a big mystery. You're like, oh, I don't know, what contact do they have with each other? But if you just pick up anything written by a scribe in Hebrew in the Hellenistic period, it's pretty instantly clear the script they're using isn't an old-time Hebrew script, it's an Aramaic script. And they're using, so in other words, the people in charge of their training as scribes were Aramaic scholars. So Aramaic scholars are running everything across this whole, across the Persian Empire, and then across the Hellenistic Empire. It wasn't exclusively Aramaic. Certainly there are really important people using Elamite, Persian, Babylonian in the Persian period, but the broadest, the people who are really spreading this everywhere across the world, Aramaic is kind of like the English or Chinese global language in this period. And so they're all being trained in a similar way. They're learning similar math. And one of the crazy things, Henrik Dronell has shown this for material in the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically the Aramaic Levi document. He's using Babylonian math to count wood offerings. It's base 60, which makes no sense at all if you're in the Levant. It's a strictly originally Sumerian-based math. Similarly, the astronomy in the book of Enoch is distinctively, uniquely Babylonian style. It uses calculations we only find in Babylonian. So we know for a fact that these guys, their higher education is in some way Babylonian based. And so, and we also know they're translating between Babylonian and Aramaic constantly. The very earliest extended Aramaic text we have, the Tel Fechurian inscription from the early 9th century BC, is a bilingual. It's a translation of Babylonian and Aramaic. So I just suddenly realized that and I did this in the 5th chapter of my book, I just put together all of the well-documented cases of translating Mesopotamian stuff into a West Semitic language, Hebrew, Aramaic, or similar. And then the picture's pretty clear that the same, they've got a shared scholarly training, and that must come with some shared literary culture and shared ideals.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So we have just about 15 minutes left. Can we take a minute and talk about the Brain Collective?
Yeah.
Because it's exciting and fascinating, and I want to hear more about it.
So this is a thing that most of our scholarly societies are pretty old. They all have wonderful accomplishments under their belt, whether that's the American Schools of Oriental Research, and using that name Oriental gives you a sense of just how old
they are.
Yeah. And, back when everyone was a very, smart European white guy who knew what that we meant by Orient, and maybe didn't mean anything harmful by it in practice, plenty of harmful stuff connected with it. So now they're getting rid of that name finally. Again, my teachers, all members of the American Oriental Society, a lot of what I know comes from publications and research by people from those societies. So, I wouldn't really be anywhere without them. Same thing, the Society of Biblical Literature. It's been around for quite a long time, many great accomplishments. The problem, the missing thing we find is that scholarly societies, that were formed in, let's say, the 19th or early 20th century, they use the tools that have been reliable tools for centuries of print publications, kind of elite membership in, you have your academic institution, you have your research budget, you go to conferences, you fly to the conferences, or I don't know, maybe you took the stagecoach back in the early days of the AOS. And they have that, that quality, but in the 21st century, the idea that, in order to be a member of, an academic society, you're going to go through all of the hoops successfully, and then you're going to be at a university or a seminary, and you're going to do, you're going to travel to see your colleagues, and you're going to read your 15-minute paper to your colleagues. The things are different now, and especially what we really wanted to do was have a society, a group, not even a society, just that was open to everyone, that was free, that was, especially in the time of COVID, but even before then, people can't afford to fly to things. People can't afford high membership fees. And there will always be a place for highly specialized research, but there also, we also need to speak in straightforward language that, what you folks are doing, and really make extra sure that we're open to everybody, because, as we know, there's all these things, ranging from subtle things like calling it the American Oriental Society, when that is a really bogus sort of blenderizing or smushing together of all these quite distinct cultures and peoples, and assuming they all have this thing in common, that they're all Oriental, which tended to have a lot of really bad connotations. And of course, going back to Edward Said's great book on this, that's a subtle example, but we wanted to make really sure to be inclusive, that we were being careful not to have manels, not to have, the panel of where everyone who gets to comment on the Pentateuch or Assyriology or the Dead Sea Scrolls, someone who looks just like me, maybe not bald, but other than that, tended to be very male, very white. And there's a classic statement you see a lot from, especially from non-white people, that that I wanted to see someone doing this who was like me, who in some way resembled me, because, that's existential proof of concept. I can talk all day about how these ideals are universal, about how, there's no gender to philology, it's just good scholarship. But then, anybody with any savvy, if they say, oh, that's interesting, so why is it only white guys who seem to be good at it? How did that happen? There's a little bit of a betrayal of the egalitarian principle. So we wanted to, mix up the people involved. Have just more of a mix of people involved too.
That's fantastic. So I'm looking at the website here, and you have workshops and different articles about various things. Are these workshops open to whoever can register for them, or is it more of a directed?
Yeah, absolutely. Every single one is open access. And that's, our main principles are, first of all, inclusivity, that we're not going to understand the ancient world in any kind of three-dimensional way, encompassing all of human experience, if we don't have people who can speak from different angles of human experience, whether that's by using methods of, feminist criticism, disability studies, as well as philology and linguistics, or people who come from those different backgrounds and are typically going to be able to see things that I can't. So inclusivity, rigor. So everything has to be done, in a point-to-point way, where you talk about how the things, what you're going to claim, comes from shareable evidence, and doesn't make metaphysical assumptions. So obviously we're very welcoming of all manners of religious background and confession. And again, that may bring insights that I couldn't have, but none of the arguments can have metaphysical assumptions. Or, and then the third thing is open access. That we are speaking to the public. Everything has to have a public face, whether that's being, and again, all of our workshops, talks, and stuff are free of charge, but also all of it's designed to have a durable public open access face. So we're, everything's going to, in some way or other, going to come out as a open access publication or document. And then the last thing is promoting new scholarship and new scholars. So we try to weight everything towards early career scholars and put them in conversation with maybe more established people.
Thank you very much. And for people who are interested in finding out more about the Brain Collective, I'm going to be putting the link to the website in the description, or you can just literally Google Brain Collective. It's BRANE, and you'll get the website and you can take a look, register for some workshops, enjoy yourselves. I am going to bring Josh back. Oh, was there something else?
Important message. We have a Twitter account, t-shirts, mugs, and tote bags. We will not be doing TikTok. I want to lay that out there clearly.
Fantastic. So go buy a t-shirt. I'll find the Twitter link as well and put that in the description. I'm going to bring Josh back into the stream. He has been collecting questions for us. Hello, Josh.
Hey, I want to put in a request though, and ask you to rethink the TikTok thing, because I think it'd be really great to see you doing one of those here's how you do the shuffle videos.
Man, I hate those dances. I do have an Instagram, and it's all like my toddler listening to Municipal Waste and thrash bands. So I mean, I guess I could have kind of like try and play some death metal versions of particularly awful biblical stories. I don't know.
I would watch that.
Well, we have a Gilgamesh rap on our channel, so I mean, anything goes. So I've tried to scroll up, and there's one super chat that I missed, so I'm really sorry, Scott Duke. But Scott Duke, very early on, for $4.99, thank you very much. He wrote, "I love these live streams. I learned so much from you and your guests. So thank you very much."
That's cool. I'm glad you're digging. Glad you're digging it. Yeah. Thoughts on Enoch's lifespan being linked to solar cults? Yeah, absolutely. This is extremely important. And right, Enoch has a very unusual lifespan. In fact, his predecessors and offspring have longer lifespans. So there's got to be something special about that 365. And it also, again, jumps out within the Bible, where they're using, in the older biblical material, it uses lunar years. So that would be more like 360. And in fact, the first person to analyze the connection between Enoch and Mesopotamian culture was Heinrich Zimmern. Jumped on this, and he pointed out that that there are connections between the sun god, the astronomy, and Mesopotamian kings, early Mesopotamian kings. So he pointed to one early king named Enmeduranki, who is in a couple of texts described as the founder of divination, and that he was taken into the assembly of the gods, which is probably not in heaven, it's probably in Babylon, and he was shown the secrets of divination. What we've learned since Zimmern is that while that 365 thing has got to be connected to Mesopotamian math and astronomy, Adapa was much more popular. There's something like 57 copies of the temple list that names him as sitting in the God of Heaven's throne, in contrast with just a couple of these Enmeduranki texts. So it seems like probably the main background for Enoch, it has to do with Mesopotamian astronomy and Adapa. So I think that's right.
Excellent. Thank you. Daniel Davis asks, where did the Moses character come from?
Well, so this is there's an important parallel between Moses and Enoch in that they both kind of leave the earthly realm. Moses ascends Mount Sinai, and then in Exodus 24, it seems like God's throne is at the top of the mountain. So Moses also is described as going into a heavenly realm to bring back divine revelation. As to where he came from, this is one of these wonderful fog-shrouded blank areas in our knowledge, because we have these biblical accounts, but we don't really have anything else that we could triangulate with. So we kind of have to just, within biblical studies, I think that there's an idea of him as the kind of legendary liberator from Egypt. And so that it may be connected with early Israelite accounts of escaping the power of the Egyptian Empire. But the reason that I steered away from Moses and towards Enoch was precisely because I thought I could get more information, more three-dimensional view of Enoch rather than Moses.
Thank you. 123 Goober P asks, and thank you very much, 15. Thanks so much to Dr. Sanders, Megan, and Josh. Really enjoyed this discussion. She has asked a number of questions, they have asked a number of questions. But one last question for Dr. Sanders. What's your next project? What questions would you like to explore?
Well, thank you so much for asking that. Yeah, I'm actually now, there's two things. One is a really long-term thing on why the Bible is so weird, why it reads so weirdly, and why it has these multiple versions of things woven together. I mean, this is the big question in Pentateuchal studies. And I think that there's some new ways to understand that, just based on the fact that nobody else in the ancient world wove together competing versions of the same story. You find some similarities in editing between Mesopotamian and Hebrew texts. Scholars like Jeffrey Teague and Sarah Milstein have written wonderful things on. But this thing where you like have, the world was created by a divine being named Elohim, and humans, men and women were created at the end of creation as the final, after all the animals and stuff. And then you go to Genesis 2, and it's like, okay, so the world was created by a guy named Yahweh, not just Elohim. And actually, he created a male first of everything, then the animals, then finally a female. So all that other stuff was wrong. Anyway, moving on, right? So what caused that? And then a second project that's more on how to approach all this stuff. Like, what's the relationship? And Megan and I talked about this at the beginning, between social theory and biblical studies. Like, how do you understand this stuff as culture? Do you see it all as ideology and just cover up or window dressing for power? If these guys really believed what they were doing, what does that mean? So that's the other one.
Excellent. Looks like we have one more super chat. Goretta Design for $5. A pet theory of mine: if Israelites were in Egypt, why does the Old Testament never mention kitty cats?
This is a glaring gap in my knowledge, and I have to confess, I may not be have the right background to understand the question, because I'm kind of a dog person. And I mean, I'm kind of joking there, but your own interests do kind of attune you to
what you study. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in modern Hebrew, you'd call it a chatultul, which is a cool name, kitty, as opposed to chatul, cat. But yeah, my knowledge ends there, I'm afraid.
I suspect that was not an entirely serious question.
Okay.
So I've got regular questions, and I don't want to go too terribly much longer because we want to limit it to maybe 5 more minutes, if you're okay to answer 5 more minutes with the questions.
Yeah, these are wonderful questions. They're really fun.
Okay, so 123 Goober P asks, given most people were illiterate and most stories would exist as oral stories, were the writing of stories attempts by scribes or others to authorize proper versions of stories?
Yeah, this is a big deal. like, what's the, like, why does one get written down and another not get written down? And then does writing it down actually force out the other versions? Is writing an act of almost kind of erasure when we say, okay, well, this is the official version. All that other stuff you heard is garbage. And actually, I want to advertise. We don't have the date posted yet, but Jenna Stover-Kemp, who's a brilliant grad student at UC Berkeley.
She was one of our HAP scholars.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Anyway, Jenna is organizing a brain panel on precisely this, which is how is textual transmission also kind of forgetting or marginalizing of other traditions? There's going to be some brilliant people commenting, including Rebecca Scharbach-Wallenberg and Annette Reed. So stay tuned for that from Brain. But to answer your question, I think that probably a lot of the initial recording is just, oh, this is interesting, let's write it down, or, oh, I'm going to compose this text from the king and I'm going to borrow or draw on all these oral traditions I already know. But then when once they get written down, scribes do start to worry about what the correct version is, and it tends to they're not automatically obsessed with it. They tend to only like get activated and start to worry when there's a specific issue to have conflict around. And you can see that, you can see the change or the desire to erase earlier versions in really neat little things. Like in the book of Samuel, it says that David took a census, and the Lord inspired David to take a census. And since that kind of tribal culture was not really very happy with bureaucracy or getting the names written down, it says then the people who took the census were smitten with a plague. People died because of it. And so, but then people were thinking, why did God trick David into making people die? So in the book of Chronicles, they retell the story and they say Satan possessed David to take a census. And it's a great example of a struggle over what the correct version is.
Interesting. I think we've got time for one more. So were Adapa or Enoch ever seen as go-betweens for humans and deities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the way that Adapa helped people was with exorcism, most commonly. That and even non-literate people, to get back to the previous questioner's point, because it's also really important that most of these texts were probably living in all kinds of environments that we don't have. But there are also images of Adapa or Adapa type figures actually literally like helping people, literally standing around their bed in their semi-human fishman guise. So a sick person could see, oh, these are the guys who are near me. These are the ones who are protecting me. So he acts as a go-between in that way. And then I think that also for the scholars, he was a go-between in another way, that he was the guy who transmitted a number of these revelations of divine knowledge to humans. With Enoch, I'll just mention he has a wild, wonderful life after the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are other narratives of Enoch that have in modern times been titled Second Enoch and Third Enoch. You can find them in the Charlesworth Old Testament pseudepigrapha volume. But he escalates and escalates in importance until he eventually is has his bones melted down and transformed into fire. His whole being is like liquidated, and he's recreated as God Jr. It's Hashem Hakatan in Third Enoch. These are much later traditions. They're like early medieval. But yeah, so he has a whole amazing life.
Wow.
Interesting.
Well,
okay. Thank you very much for your time and for answering all of our questions. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Thank you to Josh for collecting all of the audience questions. And remember, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?